everyone, and welcome to We Go Back. I'm your host, Bryan Abou Chacra, and on this week's episode, we will be reviewing This Place's Death and 316, the 5th and 6th episodes from Season 5 of Lost. We open up to something that we've been trying to tie up this entire season, which is the second person whose son believes is responsible for Jin's death. We find out that it is, of course, Benjamin Linus. And we'll get back to that in a little bit, but what I really want to focus on in this episode is where we left off in the last one. We're now back with Jin in 1988, and he realizes that he's there with the survivors of the original expedition that brought Russo to the island. We also get to hear the original transmission from the radio tower before Russo changed it, which is the numbers repeated. I believe this is the same transmission that Leonard and Sam Toomey heard when they were in the military together, and that's eventually how Hurley heard it from Leonard in the mental institute. Really interesting tie-in here. It might even be so that these flashes are what causes Sam and Leonard to actually hear it, because the island is constantly moving. I also wanted to point out that we do get to meet both of Alex's parents in this scene. I think it's really cool that they went back and gave more depth to Danielle's story, because these flashbacks really gave us something that we'd been missing from her. She had spent 16 years on the island alone after having her child abducted, and we even watched her character die. But now we're seeing how she was brought to the island, and a lot of questions get answered for what happens to her team in this episode. We see that the smoke monster attacks the group. It drags one of their own Montand down into this structure which has Egyptian hieroglyphics all over it. The other place we've seen hieroglyphics is in the Swan Hatch when it goes past zero. This is also showing us the origin of the sickness that Russo believed her team had once they got to the island. Jin experiences a flash, and when he returns, he arrives on the day that Danielle is actually executing her team for all being sick. We are now seeing the actual events that she tells Saeed when she holds him captive. We also get to see her music box fully working on the day that everything goes down. Now let's go back to the Oceanic Six. All of them have gathered at the Long Beach Pier, and they find out that the intent is for all of them to return to the island. Kate, of course, does what she normally does and books, takes Aaron, and leaves, but Sun stays because she wants to get proof from Ben that Jin is actually still alive. She and Jack agree to go with Ben, and I love the little back and forth that Jack and Sun have in this scene. They're kind of talking about how they're just going to kill Ben if he's lying to them. He genuinely seems upset that he's actually gone through a lot of effort to help them out here. So if they don't want to take it, they should just shoot him and be done with it. But it's really nice to see something genuine come from Ben. And it's also really interesting to see him help others out rather than just pushing his own agenda. We now return to the island where the survivors are rapid flashing through time, and now all of them are getting nosebleeds. We watch Charlotte's situation get worse, and I love that they use this as a way to give a sense of urgency to the story and give us an ultimatum on if they don't get to the orchid in time, they'll all end up like Charlotte. We also get to see Charlotte explain that she has been on this island before and remembers being here when she was a child. The whole reason that she's an anthropologist was because she was trying to find this island again. And the most eerie part of her explanation is that she describes a memory from when she was a child, saying that Daniel warned her to never come back to this island because if she did, she would die here. She's telling us a memory from her past. So now let's talk about something I found very interesting from when John goes down the well. A flash occurs, and the time period that they end up in doesn't seem to have any other structures around it. The only thing that you see is the rope in the ground. So that means that the rope was likely the reason the well was put there. Now on the other side of the well, we see John find Christian, and we're told that Locke was supposed to be the one to move the island, not Ben. So maybe the cause of all of this is really that Locke didn't fulfill his purpose, and he's told by Christian that he needs to bring them all back by finding a woman named Eloise Hawking. One thing that I wanted to bring up here, which I think might help explain why the flashes were occurring, we heard Dr. Chang talk about how they would be able to manipulate time in the Orchid Station. The wheel is a prehistoric method of time and space manipulation, and since it's been off its axis, That's what causes the island to bounce around in physical space as well as time. In Los Angeles, Desmond arrives and we realize that Eloise Hawking is Faraday's mother. And this will take us into 316. This episode is really interesting because it's calling back to the original circumstances of the crash that brought them to the island. They even mention that a million times throughout this episode. So we open up with almost the exact same opening as the original crash. However, I find it really interesting that the way they wrote the story was to give us that answer at the top of the show. They could have made you have to sit through an entire 44 minutes to see if they made it on the island, but rather than doing that, they tell you right off the bat, there were so many factors that kept Kate from wanting to be there, Hurley from wanting to be there, Saeed from wanting to be there, but they all make it back. To me, that's a much more compelling way to tell a story because you're taking an expectation and turning it on its head. Now, one of the things that I did want to bring up to you at the beginning of this episode is the painting behind Eloise. We have it addressed by Ben later on in the episode, but it's fairly prominent when they walk in. This is the portrait of Doubting Thomas. We learn that this is somebody who is skeptical and refuses to believe something without personal experience. And obviously, this ties to Jack throughout the episode. So I'll be focusing on those examples in this episode. We also get an explanation for what this place is. It's a Dharma station called the Lamppost, which helps the Dharma Initiative find windows that take you to the island. Interestingly enough, while Jack is in that station, he looks around and finds a photo of the island from September 23rd, 1954. That's one day after and 50 years earlier than the date of their original crash. In this scene, they're all being told what to do, and Desmond, in disbelief, tries to convince Jack that this is all insane. And this conversation here seems so interesting because he uses very specific words. He tells Jack that they are all being moved around like pieces in a game. And I want to bring this up to you because of how Eloise responds to Desmond. She seems to have knowledge that's contrary to what Desmond is saying. And it almost seems like she doesn't even bother contesting it because she knows it's futile. Now let's focus on the scene between Eloise and Jack, where we find out that John had actually killed himself. We still have no idea what happened since he left the island. We don't know where he's been in that 3-year span, but we do know that the man in the coffin is John Locke, and that if they want to get back to the island, they need to, as best they can, recreate the circumstances that got them to the island to begin with. So John Locke is going to have to be the proxy for Christian Shepherd, the man who we had just seen help him get off the island. And of course, Jack, much like Doubting Thomas, doesn't want to believe any of this. But Eloise plainly puts it to Jack, you have to take a leap of faith. But I find it interesting that he has issues with taking a leap of faith when he has somebody so close to him in his family, like his grandfather. He doesn't care where he's going, but he believes that he'll be able to get there one day if he keeps trying. While he's helping Ray unpack, Jack finds a pair of dress shoes that used to be his father's. So Jack had just been told that he needs to bring something of his father's to give to Locke, and right after gets a pair of his father's shoes. And these shoes, we end up finding out, are really important because on the day that Jack took his father back to the States, all he could put on him was a pair of white sneakers. He couldn't even go out and get a nice pair of dress shoes. If you go back to the opening shot of the original pilot, you see hanging from a tree a pair of white sneakers. And if we go back to the mobisodes, Christian is seen wearing white tennis shoes. I mean, this is something that you see every time he appears on the island. He is wearing those white tennis shoes. Despite all of this evidence, Jack is still defiant. He refuses to believe that John was right and that he was never meant to leave the island. You hear him say this in his monologue as he's talking to a deceased John Locke while he's putting on the shoes that he brought to help get them back to the island. The chinks in the armor continue to form as he's checking in the body of John Locke. Everyone slowly starts to show up. One way or another, they all showed up. And one thing you should pay attention to if you didn't already notice is that they are going on a JIRA Flight 316. During the flashes earlier on the season, we saw Najira Airway water bottle. This episode really does play out like the pilot, just turned on its head. It's the best recreation of the original circumstances, and we see that all of them kind of fall into different places. And this is causing Jack to start to really see the faith that's going on around him. And it's really hard for Jack to continue to fight against this. But if he needed even just a little bit more evidence, we find out that Frank Lapidus is the pilot on the flight. But we are continuing to see Jack's armor crumble. And I think we finally see his moment of tenderness when he realizes that John wants him to read that letter. And when he finally opens it, all it says is that I wished you would have believed me. And that's a very significant message for John to leave Jack. And we know that Jack has issues with that as well. He has a hard time trusting anybody. He always lies to people. He can't just take a leap of faith and believe in someone else. As he finishes reading the letter, we get caught back up with the beginning of the episode, and we go through all the motions, but now we get the next part of the story. A Dharma van pulls up, and who comes out? Jin. And in this entire episode, we've been so excited to find out how they all got back on the island, we almost totally forgot about everybody that John left behind. Guys, thanks for sticking through this episode of We Go Back. Next week, we will be reviewing the life and death of Jeremy Bentham and LaFleur. Any questions, thoughts, emails, you know where they go. WeGoBackPodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @KingLordBryan. And until next episode, you guys stay good.